Welcome to StoryTalk, a roundtable discussion of a single story at a time. I'm Matthew Schmidt, and joining me, as always, are Ingrid Wenzler.
Hi.
And Adam al-Sirgany.
Howdy.
Today we'll be discussing Janus by Ann Beattie from her 1986 collection, Where You'll Find Me. The story follows Andrea, a real estate agent obsessed with a, quote, perfect bowl. It's perfect at home, but also in any house she's trying to sell. Simplistic in terms of summary, the story examines what the bowl means to Andrea and her life. At this point, I'll ask if there's anything else you want to preface before we get going.
I think in terms of key plot points, we're going to get there.
Agreed.
All right. Well, let's dive into it. We've got a very nice bowl that Ingrid has put out in the center of the table. The first question I have is, why does Beatty choose to tell the story in close third person? And how does this choice affect the plot and unfolding of the story?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of reasons that she probably chooses third person, right? Like, obviously, I don't know, Ann Beattie's mine, but my guess is that the close third gives her the ability to both stay with that character in a kind of, right, Ingrid's obsessed with what's his face? Now I can't think of his name.
Edward P. Jones?
No.
I think that's true.
He is my newest obsession.
Yeah.
Chekhov?
No.
That's another good guess.
The critic, but
James Wood.
James Wood, who really, he loves to talk about free indirect, like mode as being like this close third that allows you to sort of jump out into omniscience, jump into a person's individual perspective and way of looking at the world. And I think that what's needed for a story that has a sort of objective correlative, right, like this particular story does, by which I mean that the bowl represents something in a very direct way. I don't know if this is, I feel like I have to be mysterious about it because Ann Beattie's a little mysterious about it, right? Like, but that's one of the reasons she's chosen that close third, is so she can dance around the fact the bowl very much represents a now absent lover to Andrea. And I think that's part of it, but also that we can kind of get this. I mean, I think Andrea, bless her heart, as the Southerners say, would be a little like a really kind of aggravating middle-class white lady if you just like had to be with her as a person in her day-to-day life just selling stuff. Maybe that's my prejudice from having worked with a lot of real estate people, where like what she's thinking about isn't terribly interesting. It's much more about this kind of like peeling back the layers of the onion thing and working through why this bowl is important from a sort of like object that has the function of helping her sell houses to getting down to the person, right? Like, and you start to actually care about the person by watching those layers come out in a way that you don't as like the bowl fits. Very early on, the bowl was perfect, and you understand that it's something that she puts into the house in a way that functions to create, right, a sort of delusion, the way that other things help, right? Like by putting a fire in the fireplace, you start to like get the idea of coziness, as if you're ever going to like use the fireplace on the regular, or as if that isn't like deeply inconvenient, or as if in order to sell that the largely unused fireplace hasn't like been a high cost, right, to like clean out and to make sure that it's safe to use for those purposes, and so on and so forth. Or the artificial scent, or I can't remember the flowers. I'm always bad with flowers. It's like jacarandas or something.
Like they're jonquils.
Jonquils.
I largely agree, Adam. I think Beatty uses third, really close third, really expertly, and makes use of what that perspective offers a story. So looking at the first paragraph is where I think like her using this perspective and what it offers is sort of most clear, but I'd like to point out a few other places where it works really well as well. So the first paragraph is, the bowl was perfect. Perhaps it was not what you'd select if you faced a shelf of bowls, and not the sort of thing that would inevitably attract a lot of attention at a crafts fair. Yet it had real presence. It was as predictably admired as a mutt who has no reason to suspect he might be funny. Just such a dog, in fact, was often brought out and in along with the bowl. So notice that we have no character in this paragraph. I think close third is at its best when what it does is it sort of plays between, it works between close third and omniscience, and sometimes kind of gets outside of perspective, so you're not sure if it's the narrator or if it's the character who's thinking.
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that in the middle of the story, so often with a story that's in close third, you'll start with something more like omniscience, and you won't be clear on if what you're getting is the narrator or the omniscient narrator or the character.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think the beautiful thing about this first paragraph is it leans heavily toward the character's perspective. It may very well be her, but it also may be some sort of omniscience presence. And then as we move through, as also I think is usual with close third, we get tagged thoughts. So about a page in, we get, the wonderful thing about the bowl, Andrea thought, was that it was both subtle and noticeable, a paradox of a bowl. So, I mean, there we get that this thought belongs to Andrea very clearly. As we move into the story, though, we get farther and farther from those tagged thoughts and more into the kind of thoughts that would be classically free and direct and untagged. And I think that works really well and kind of lends to the sort of mystical quality of the story. In fact, I'm trying to find it. Well, I'll come back to this when I do find it, but I think there are moments where we're actually much closer to her thoughts and what they might sound like in her head, but at this kind of weird distance, and I think that's a really cool effect of the perspective in this story and how Beatty ends up working it.
Yeah, I think it's a weird thing about, right, pointing out the way that she describes the dog is, I think, actually fairly important, right? Like, because the dog isn't, just such a dog isn't how you think about your own dog, even if you understand that your dog is serving some function. Which is also, but it, like, the kind of phrasing of that, of like, I'm thinking in some kind of like logical or hyper-logical way in order to achieve some effect for these people who I'm not really thinking of as people, but as clients and or buyers. Right, like, which is always the disturbing thing about being a salesperson, which makes, especially residential real estate people frightening, right? Because, like, there's so much creating an image of a home, or this kind of image of, like, all of these McMansions are the same, but look at this bowl in the middle of the house or something, right? That you could plausibly be thinking of your dog in that moment as just such a dog in relation to just such a bowl that has this quality that I'm trying to grasp. And it floats on that kind of trapeze line of, like, something that could be in her head or something that's a little overly technical and distanced from her. And I think that, like, if it were in that, I think also in that first person, like, I mean, there's something about verisimilitude there, right? Like, there's a, like, kind of tangential thought, but, like, as I'm saying the other thing, I'm realizing that, like, I never think in my own head of myself as like, I, Adam, love this ball. Like, and there's something more realistic about, or it feels more realistic about third person, that you're almost thinking of yourself as the body doing things like placing bowls or washing bowls or, you know, being dismissive of your husband while he's throwing keys into said bowl. And on and on and on, right? But
Yeah, I actually, while you were doing this work, I did find the example that I was looking for of a sort of more distance thought, too, that happens within close third. So the line is, it was clear that she would not be the one who would do anything to the bowl. Think about if this line came earlier in the story and we didn't have a character to attach it to yet. I mean, it sounds like omniscience, or it could be coming from some sort of like higher, strange universal power. And I mean, I think that's really in keeping with the tone the story is subtly working to move toward.
yeah.
Well, there's also the fact, right, that the husband is told not to put his keys in the bowl, very specifically.
Yeah.
That is, nothing can be put in the bowl. The bowl is the bowl, and it's, you know, and I think that goes along with like the fact that for whatever reason she has this strange understanding that she can't harm the bowl in a very specific way that's not really explained, other than to say like she doesn't worry about harming the bowl even when like moving it, washing it, you know, whatever. She's more worried about someone else harming the bowl.
Yeah. I mean, in a kind of obsessive compulsive disorder way, like it does become talismanic, and she's got like magical thinking around the bowl and how it operates to the degree that, I mean, she actually later on realizes that like she's attributing all of her real estate success to the bowl, and she can't communicate that to her husband, which I think has to do with what the bowl sort of metaphorically is to her, but I think also is just that like when you know you have an illogical thought, like
You don't want to share it with people that will take that illogical thought and make it something that it's not for you.
Hell yeah, I think like
Judge it, or I mean the vulnerability that goes along with that.
Yeah, I mean I think about like Michael Jordan, right? Like, and how weird it must have been to be like a public person who's talking about like, oh yeah, I wear like my college shorts under my professional shorts as my lucky underwear, and like how frightening that is, and how hard it actually is to say something. I mean, I say like OCD about that, like that belief, or magical thinking about that belief, but actually like I don't think it's, you know, the version of that that's actually sort of like pathological. Like all of us have that stuff. It's really hard to like say out loud, even to people you trust, because it sounds ridiculous.
Well, and is more acceptable in certain realms. Like, I think, you know, your point about Michael Jordan and what we allow artists versus, you know, more traditional business people is some of what I think this story is expertly toying with. Like, I think it's a story that resists easy characterization and easy scene. And, you know, I mean, I think sometimes as I read, I kind of come up with like expectations and questions on first read to sort of see how many times the author ends up subverting them. And, you know, I expected in a lesser writer's hands for this character to be really paranoid about breaking the bowl.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the way that gets handled is really interesting. And likewise, how Andrea gets characterized as a real estate agent. She is certainly someone who's preoccupied with staging a home and with presenting it in certain ways. But there's something unusual about her in that position. I'm sure we'll get into that more, but...
Well, let's get into it now. I mean, you know, like, what type of a character is Andrea? You know, the staging is a really interesting aspect of her real estate job. And she is very aware of the illusions that she and other real estate agents use. You know, Adam earlier said she was middle class. Is she middle class? You know, because she's a real estate agent. Her husband is a stockbroker. We don't get a whole lot about the husband, really, but suffice it to say, he's probably making some money.
Yeah.
And we do know that she is doing well and even taking on more clients than she's actually comfortable with.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe you can point out some characteristics of Andrea in the text as well.
Yeah, I think that, like, apart from, right, like, I'm going to defend the notion that she's middle class, and that, like, she, at one point, they were struggling while they were going to grad school. Both of them went to grad school, but both of them are working in business. This is a story written in the 80s, which, like, means it's presumably the 80s or pre-80s. Like, this is a story written in the mid-80s, no less, right? Like, and the kind of rise of the real estate period, right? Like, and also the rise of, like, the kind of quants and, like, technical real estate people, right? Like, I think, like, all of that, right? She knows things like people who liked country furniture always commented on the bowl, but then it turned out that people who felt comfortable with Biedermeier loved it just as much. You know, like, it's not only that she is working her job, but she has, I think, a kind of, you know, a comfortable awareness and characterizes people within the terms of the sort of objects of their living spaces. She's also someone who, at that point, right, is, like, hanging out at crafts fairs, right? Like, I don't know where she went to school or how she went to school, but she's, like, she was poor as a grad student, but now her husband is buying a Leica lens, and she can be totally indifferent to it. Which, right, like, I think all of those things are significations of a comforture with the middle class and the upper middle class and exposure to those people. I think, like, as a person, she's also, I mean, she and or the close third, I'm looking for, it's a great line. She's speaking of her husband and herself, or she's thinking of her husband and herself. Quote, "They both liked details, but while ironies attracted her, he was more impatient and dismissive when matters became many-sided or unclear. But they both knew this. It was the kind of thing they could talk about when they were alone in the car together, coming home from a party or after a weekend with friends. But she never talked to him about the bowl." End quote. I think they're both, you know, in that description, both pretty logical. There's something about his job and all those other kinds of things that, you know, make sense to sort of deal in the mathematics of stockbrokering. They're also the kind of people who have a weekend with friends. Like, they go somewhere to have that weekend. It's not like, you know, going to the park with friends and having a barbecue or grilling out and having some beers or something. It's all those kinds of things are there. I mean, in some ways, she becomes a little flat for me in that way, right? Like, because I see all of those signifiers, and because they all, like, skew to a very particular sort of, like, type, it takes me the better part of the story to start to see her as a person and not as a character.
Oh, that's interesting. I had a kind of different experience with her as a character, in that, you know, I mean, I think this question in particular is a tricky one for me to answer, in that I think kind of like the bowl. We have moments where we do get sort of direct characterization of Andrea, like actually the one you point out.
Yeah.
About her and her husband is one of the only instances in a short story where we're sort of kind of told things about who Andrea is. In that same paragraph, we get that she and her husband both are quiet and reflective and slow to make judgments. So, I mean, I think that's being told, who she is and what she's like, and, we get to decide as readers if that judgment is actually true as we move through the story. I don't have a lot of reason to think it's not. But otherwise, we know she's a real estate agent right away. We don't know why she's a real estate agent, and I realize, especially as I move through the story, that I'm not sure that we, get much about like why she's in this job. What's motivating her to be a real estate agent? Does she need the money? Does she enjoy the game of it? We don't get answers to questions like that in this story. And in fact, like, there are moments where Beatty really holds back, where we start to get a little something like that she went to grad school and she and her husband didn't have that much money at first, and so we're drawn to material things. And I start to think, oh, okay, now we're going to move into kind of classic middle-class real estate space. Like, this is going to be a story about materialism to some extent. But we find out that actually, like, the desire for objects sort of dwindles for them. The attachment that she has to this bowl is a strange attachment, more talismanic than, like, classically material. And we don't find out why she's going to craft fairs, what she studied in grad school, things that might help us like kind of piece together her trajectory a little more. And I think the way the story's organized is kind of about that, about kind of moving us through this territory where there are a lot of questions that aren't answered, and then seeming to give us some at the end, but not really.
Yeah, actually, to your point, I think, while I think of Andrea, like, I have a hard time connecting with her, I think the story itself is really extremely tightly and well crafted in that way. In that same paragraph we both referenced, right? With regard to her husband, he was a stockbroker and sometimes told people that he was fortunate to be married to a woman who had such a fine aesthetic sense and yet could also function in the real world. And I think that individual sentence is super withholding,
but I mean, so important
so
at the same time. Yeah, agreed.
The real world in that sentence being the world of money and status.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and
there's an inference to Ingrid's point about what she did for grad school. Something about aesthetic sense means artsy in, like, upper middle class rich people talk, right? Like,
right.
I don't give a shit about the art, but, like, I'm glad that I have arm candy that says something about art that sounds intelligent. And
he's glad she makes him look better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also in a way that he can talk about it. Like,
right.
It's one of the few times we see Andrea outside of Andrea / the narrator, because he's actually verbalizing it to other people in front of her.
yeah, and I mean, I think one of the reasons why that line becomes so telling is it gives us, in this small gesture, a sense of why Andrea isn't comfortable telling her husband about the bowl.
Yeah.
Because it's impractical in those ways. It's something that's outside of his realm of the real world.
But incidentally,
This relationship and attachment.
Yeah, I think that there's also a time when, admittedly, pulling this thought off of Mad Men, but there was a time when, like, Leicas weren't sort of like a trade tool, but they were just expensive, like, middle class cameras. And there's something though that, like, there's a possibility in that is his expensive buy, or her example is his expensive buy, that he at least might have an aesthetic sense. I mean, it might just be that he's like, we don't get mention of children, we get the dog. Maybe he just likes going on vacation with her and taking caricatures of the two of them standing by beaches or something. But like, and there's some inference in the things that they actually do purchase.
Right, and I mean, I think that's the perfect example of the ways in which this story, like with its minimalism, ends up, you know, I guess making it harder for us to make definable judgments about characters and moments and meaning. Like, I think, you know, we're reaching to understand the husband as, you know, someone who doesn't get the arts or who's using the arts in some ways. And then we get the Leica, and we're like, well, maybe he uses this. We don't know how he uses this. And it's doing that thing constantly.
So, the bull is like center stage in this particular story.
Yeah.
What is the deal with the bull? Like, it's very strange at the end, like, as far as like a larger meaning, right, is concerned. It's not necessarily like conclusive in that manner, while being conclusive in the story, so to speak. It's part of the bull is like the image we end on.
Yeah.
So what is the deal with it, and why is it that Andrea becomes so attached to it?
You know, again, I think that's a difficult question to answer, so, you know, let me endeavor. I think I want to start by thinking about tone a little bit. I think because Beatty chooses a bull, you know, this could easily tilt toward satire or toward just kind of straight humor. Like, there's something about a bull that, of course, is a little ridiculous, as something to have what she at times describes as like almost a relationship with. Like, this bull has the qualities of a magical object, like a good luck charm, a rabbit's foot type thing, or, you know, a person.
Yeah.
You know, she describes at one point when she has left the bull behind, that people sometimes leave their children behind. And she consoles herself, realizing that she's remembered the bull sooner than people sometimes remember their children.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, the funny, troubling thought that it is. I mean, I think the magical thinking and the bull as object do verge on funny, but the story also, I find, urges us to try to look at this bull with Andrea and its sort of ineffable qualities. And, you know, I mean, I think dangerous territory for a story that's dealing with the middle class, but, you know, I don't feel like this ends up becoming too banal.
No,
I think it actually, like, really urges us to look at this bowl as she does, as kind of special, and as, you know, a thing of beauty in a world where, you know, beauty doesn't always have to be big or small. So, I mean, I guess I think of her connection to the bowl as being really interesting in a piece so short and in one so minimal, in that I think it does carry symbolism. You know, I mean, you can think of the bowl as womb. You can think of it as, you know, kind of a classically, like, female object. But I think the story doesn't push that interpretation. I personally like that. I think actually, like, the line that feels to me like the thesis statement of this story is what she believed was that it was something she loved.
Yeah.
I think in a way it's that simple. She loves this bowl, and it brings her actual joy, and she sometimes uses it for a job that her relationship is unclear. Her relationship toward is kind of unclear, but we get to see this bowl through her eyes in a lot of different scenes, and I think I believe about it that it's something beautiful to her and to others.
Yeah, I think that, we start this story off hearing that the bowl was perfect. It's late in the story, actually, we get this insight that leads into her believing that it's something she loved. The bowl was a mystery even to her. It was frustrating because her involvement with the bowl contained a steady sense of unrequited good fortune. It would have been easier to respond if some sort of demand were made in return. But that only happened in fairy tales. The bowl was just a bowl. And I think that, that's sort of the beauty of what the bowl is and how it works in this story, right? Is that, like, anything that matters to it, most things that matter to us aren't like, hey man, those, like, that's my liver, right? Like, or like, that's my heart, or like, I should buy a better pair of running shoes because I only get this one pair of feet, even, right? Like, that kind of extended logic doesn't work, and she ends up, right, like, I think allowing herself to fall in with the bowl, if you will, because it has the delusional practical virtue of being a setting piece for the houses that she's, like, selling. And that's like, I've been thinking in a kind of, like, psychoanalytical way, maybe, of like, what's the process that this individual undertakes to have this very specific relationship to a bowl. And if you sort of track it, not from the way that the story articulates the narrative, which is an individual unwinding her experience with the bowl herself, but, like, if you take it from the sort of chronological experience, it's, for whatever reason, I'm cheating on my husband. The person I'm cheating on my husband with wants me to, like, take that secondary relationship seriously, maybe even make it my primary relationship. I'm incapable of communicating about that because, right, like, there's something important, like having an aesthetic sense but being practical enough to operate in the quote-unquote real world. And this bowl comes to represent the beautiful things that I can't desire and just go for, but rather, like, my inability to do that. It's something, right, like many things, right, like, we see, I think most of us see sort of better worlds by being handed the inkling of that better world, right? Like, maybe because it's like something semi-holy because it came from the lover, or maybe because she just needed a stage setting piece one day. She starts putting the bowl in, and then somebody, like, wants to buy a house, right? Like, I think one significant thing about the bowl is that she notes that she's, like, attributing her real estate success to the bowl. The bowl's coming to all these houses. But some of the ways she thinks about the bowl is, for instance, a woman who doesn't put a bid in on the house calls her up, mentions the bowl, and asks her to find out from the owners where they got the bowl because she wants to get a like bowl. I think all of that is indicative of the way that she's looking for the moments when the bowl carries a bigger weight, but also I think in that interaction, or those kinds of interaction, she's seeing, I I've been thinking all day about how to describe this. And I still haven't quite gotten there, but she's thinking about, right, like she's stage setting a home. It's like a Potemkin thing, right? Like it's fake, and she knows it's fake, and it's supposed to make you feel like it's homey in a way that you're never going to have something homey in the real world. But there are these indicators that hominess is possible if you get past the salesmanship. And that bowl is sort of that line where, like, if you could take it and acquire it and put it in the home, it's a useless object. It's not meant to be filled with the keys or anything else. It's just an object that has a power, like an influence on your life. And I think it's like it starts to take all that on for her in time until the bowl precedes anything like thinking about the lover, or the bowl precedes actually worrying about whether or not the bowl is really helping sell houses, or it's just that the bowl is at every house.
Yeah, a lot of stuff there. I think one thing that interests me is the fact that when she's at the craft fair with the lover, she sees the bowl. She likes the bowl. She lingers by the bowl, but she doesn't buy the bowl. She, in fact, goes on to the next stand and is looking at some other things. And the lover brings her the bowl, and she says, "Oh, do you want me to buy this still?" You know, basically. And he's like, No, I bought this for you.
Yeah.
Right? So the bowl actually like enters her life only through her relationship with this other person.
Yeah.
But also only like through the other person like making her take the bowl.
Yeah.
Like it's not even her choice. Which is interesting because she like later thinks about the presents that the lover has gotten her. One's like a nice box, one's a ring, and one is a sweatshirt, which has the front pouch. And the lover's like claim is that when he's not there, she can hold her own hand through the pouch as if he was there. And that is an insane thing to say, because you don't need the pouch to do that. But like it's that idea that the gift is from him, and so like somehow he's still touching her.
Yeah.
Because like he used his money to like give her something practical, but also like secretly from him that the husband doesn't know.
Yeah.
That she didn't like go out and purchase herself. So speaking of the lover, at one point the lover wants more.
Yeah.
He basically gives her an ultimatum, and is asking her generally to leave her husband and be with him. And one of the questions he asks her, like before they eventually split up, which they do, is why she wants to be two-faced, right? The story is called Janus, and it's spelled Janus, the god Janus. How do you see authorial choices develop your understanding of Andrea's decisions at the end of the story?
Yeah, I think while I've like picked on Andrea as a sort of middle class lady, right? Like I think we don't get a lot of, to Ingrid's earlier point, background about either the husband or Andrea, right? Like that we don't know how they meet, we don't know if they were ever particularly in love. We know that there was a time in grad school where there was like resource scarcity, for like lack of a less technical term, and now there isn't resource scarcity, and so on and so forth, right? And that makes, also to Ingrid's point, the things they buy not important, right? Like that you can walk past something and to care about or desire it, even observing it, right? Like, you can be indifferent to the purchase, right? There isn't an ache about the bowl at first. It seems like there might even be an irritation in the quote you read, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm done looking at this bowl. And I think that, like, that's a weird thing, right? Like, that, I don't know, maybe it has to do with, like, the kinds of environments that I've been raised in, the kinds of people that, like, I've worked with over the years, and all those kinds of things. But, right, like, I think there's this, like, this delusion of needing to achieve something, right? Going to, based on the terms of the story, I'm going to get through grad school, I'm, like, scrimping, I'm saving, and so on and so forth. And now I'm an individual and I have aesthetic sense, but I can operate in the real world, and there are all these kinds of sort of social ideologies and pressures from the people that you're, you know, whether because you love them and you've chosen to be trapped with them, or like you just are with them for whatever reasons Andrea is with her husband, right? Like that you've worked toward a goal, you've worked toward a goal, you've worked toward a goal. There's no longer resource scarcity, but the cost of actually getting there isn't worth the outcome, or it's ultimately unfulfilling, right? Like to be able to buy the bowl or not buy the bowl, or wander the craft fair and be indifferent to buying the bowl. And it strips something of, right, it takes aesthetic sense and it turns even the aesthetic sense into a commodity. It's something that her husband can tell people about when they're at parties. And it takes the real beauty out of that, right? It only leaves you with the opinion and the affirmation of being able to say, well, look at me, I have, you know, a 401k, and I sell these beautiful houses, and I have a beautiful house, and I have these objects, and I can point to the Biedermeier, and I know that, and so on and so forth. And here I am. And I think it leaves her with, the sense I get is that it leaves her without the thing that would make that worth it, right? They're just objects at that point, or they're just including the marriage itself. But because she's in some way worked for it, or she has a sense of self that is to be this salesperson, or to be a person with aesthetic sense operating in the real world, that she can't whimsically, I think most people get that way in their sort of 30s and 40s. They can't whimsically go like, well, actually, fuck, man, like this is not working out, and this isn't happy, and this isn't what I wanted out of my life. And you know what? It was good to learn that over the process of doing this or that for 10, 15 years, but in fact, I like being single, or I like dating, or I want to have some, whatever that is, right? Like, and she can't choose that. She wants to be, I think, two-faced, because being two-faced doesn't require her to choose. And part of what's significant about the bull and about the lover is that the lover chooses because he wants something more to walk away. And so, like, being two-faced, right, like, is the thing that takes it. It's the thing that temporarily feels like she gets to have everything, but because she has to have everything in a way that doesn't allow for the lover to have what he needs, she ends up with the bull, right? And I think, interestingly, right, like, there isn't really a mention of the goddess Janus in the story, and which leaves me with a lot of questions about whether or not, right, like I'm supposed to think about. I mean, Janus is two-faced, but I don't know that she's always bad in the stories, right? Like,
yeah, actually, to understand the title a little better, I did a little Wikipediaing around Janus, and you know, she's the Roman god of war and peace, and beginning and ending, and is associated with being two-faced in these ways of kind of representing opposites.
Yeah.
But I think I was looking for ways in which her story might tie to this story a little more, and I think the conclusion that I've come to about that and about this story much more broadly is that it's a story that resists interpretation.
Yeah, I think Dr. Schmidt's over here rightfully noting to me that I always do this with Janus because of the common female name, which is why he spelled it earlier, but I'm misgendering Janus.
It's a he, yeah.
Oh, oops.
No, that's my fault.
A small minor.
Yeah.
No. I'm glad you corrected. Also, related to that, I think the ordering of this story is really, really careful and smart. So we get the information about the lover at the very end. And I think part of why I'm thinking about this story as one that resists interpretation is because at every turn it kind of puts a new spin on things. I think coming to that ending, I think, okay, so she's deflected, so this bowl is a stand-in for her lover, but I think that's too pat a read for this story. We don't get any earlier information where she's thinking about the bowl and associating it with him, and I mean, really her exchange with him about these gifts and about his leaving, she's kind of resistant to him and doesn't seem to be nostalgic for him. The bowl really is the center, so I mean, either the psychological deflection is going very deep, and in terms of her magical thinking, she's way off. But I mean, I think this is a story about the bowl as an object, and I mean, it's especially that last paragraph that makes me think so, and actually makes me think about Janus as well. So the last paragraph is, time passed. Alone in the living room at night, she often looked at the bowl sitting on the table, still and safe, unilluminated. In its way, it was perfect, the world cut in half, deep and smoothly empty. Near the rim, even in dim light, the eye moved toward one small flash of blue, a vanishing point on the horizon. I think in this last paragraph, we do get twos, which call to Janus, and we get the bowl cut in half. We see for the first time why we've been paying attention to the blue in the bowl. It's kind of like an earth-like half. But I mean, I think this ending calls to this kind of universal, ungraspable power and force. And I mean, I think that finally is what the story's reaching to be about. The weird force of this bowl and its beauty. I think I sort of, when I get outside of the story and I think about it the way you do, I worry for this character. She's clearly unhappy in her marriage. Able to communicate with her husband about some things, but keeping secrets in other ways, not talking about what she feels most connected to, and I mean, not seeming to be especially connected to her work. We don't get much insight into other aspects of her life. The story's bowl-centric.
Yeah.
But
I like it.
in terms of the moments that she has with this bowl, I mean, I think they're about her seeing beauty in her day, looking at light and looking at what it does to the bowl and things like that. And I mean, I think this is a strange power that fiction has. I often find myself drawn to characters who are kind of deeply dysfunctional and dreamy, and I mean psychologically who are not making it. But I mean, I think this story is actually really charming in that way. I think it pulls the kind of tricks that it's talking about. I mean, I think Andrea is drawn to the bull as something that's capable of tricking, but also as something that's simple and pure in its way. And I mean, I think the story tricks us into seeing the bull's beauty, and I mean, shows us in the ways in which we're constantly trying to like reach for easy answers and not look for magic and beauty in the world.
I think, there's one thing that I'm really attached to about the ball as an image, right? Like, partly because of our mutual professor, Tenny Nathanson, who used to remind our class often how hard it is to make something look random.
Yeah.
And I think not insignificantly, the thing that's random about the bowl is the gold flecking, right? Like, it's the glints themselves that kind of draw the eye around, and there's something that becomes a sort of, star-like infinity about that as an object to look at, but also in the sort of the movement from house to house to house, right? Like, the momentum of the thing creates new possibilities of the object. I've been working through all the I can't say her name, Tukarkuk's book Flights, which is very much about different kinds of movement being the way in which we experience the world, right? There's a sort of ongoing, like, odd situation where there are psychologists giving talks about travel psychology and about our mental spaces being about movement, which in that book is linked to sort of the Eastern Orthodox religion having a sort of thread of belief about movement being that kind of creative power for us. And I think that bull goes with her, right? And it's only the fear of that bull moving away from her, right? She's going to break it, but she's still...
that she's worried about.
Yeah, that has that. But it's fairly rare that I get to see a piece of art in multiple museums, but on the occasions I do, right? Like, it teaches you a lot about the significance of curation and location and how to place something, right? Like, and what that does. And I think that the bowl's randomization and sort of infinities, both as the bowl itself and as a moving object, becomes something bigger for her, and maybe start to represent, like, outside of the lover, right? Like, represent what the lover could have represented and why you might want to be positively two-faced, right? Like, which is never to be pinned down or to be held down or to be left somewhere, but to keep in a kind of momentum which creates.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find most interesting about Janus, the god, is that he's somehow the god of doorways and passageways, which is an amazing thing to think about in this story. Yeah, because, like, her whole thing, as Adam is talking about, is not wanting to be pinned down. And, like, Janus is represented as a two-faced man, and, like, Andrea is both interested in her husband and this other lover for different reasons, and was more interested in one at a different time than another, right? And so, like, it's the options are open, and there's also the idea that this bull goes through all these doorways and passageways, and yet is always finds a perfect spot within whatever room the bull decides to be in. We also earlier, right, got the fact that the husband doesn't like things that are many-sided, and she does, right? There's the fact that the bull is many-sided. The husband is more of a square. Yeah. Let's face it. He's just a square. He wants to fit in. Yeah. She doesn't want to fit in. She likes the option to fit in. Yeah. And she likes the option not to fit in. Right? Her life is also roughly halfway over. like just in terms of lifespan, right? She's gone to school, she's got a career, she's gotten married. It's probably getting late to have children. They don't have children. That's still an option though. Like it's probably they have several years probably left to have a child, but they haven't. And so like the fact that the bowl is a circle cut in half, or like the world cut in half, is also like her timeline as a person. Like she can do anything still. Once you have a child, you have very specific responsibilities for a point, for a length of time. The marriage is supposedly a responsibility in the way it's set up as a cultural thing, but she has chosen to, I suppose not honor that specific religious ideal. A child, though, is a different thing. Because that is another being. It's not something you can just throw off and everything's fine. So, like at this point, she can still look at the sky, which is the horizon of the end of the story, and like see anything she wants to see. And so, I found that like especially impressive within the story. I wanted to finish up and kind of put you two in like a teaching role by asking like, what is it that invests an object with meaning and power, right? We've discussed a lot of this, but like, let's take that and map that onto like what makes a story have meaning and power, and like what are some tools or tactics someone could use to achieve these things?
Shit. That's a big welcome question. I think for me, a lot of what gives stories power is actually not utterly dissimilar to, at least at root, to what gives like a poem power, right? I think words are all metaphors of a kind, right? Like you can never say the word tree into creating a tree, and putting on a page creates this extra, almost but not quite, at least in English, ideogrammic experience about the illusion of a tree. I think we're really accustomed to that particular like drama, so we don't have it happen to us in the same way. And I think that's a cool thing that stories do. I think that they often bring that drama back to us by placing sort of objects and people into a world where we connect with them on a human level, and then we see, while they're doing that, their connection to these sort of metaphors that widen our world sometimes to the point of being like this bowl. Like there's a sort of infinite number of possibilities that drift off it, right? So I mean, I described the bowl as being a sort of objective correlative, and I think I usually use that term in a slightly dismissive way, right? Like the bowl equals the lover who's not there anymore, or something. But I think in fact what Beatty does that's really brilliant is the bowl equals the lover. The bowl also equals, as you noted, half of the world, and which is sort of half of the life, or as Ingrid noted, sort of a womb-like image that, and I think Beatty finds these incredible ways to include all of what it is to sort of be in your own half-life, right? Whether it's the feeling of the bowl being left behind actually being like leaving a child behind, but she only makes it a mile away, or whether it's the bowl is itself like the lover, or like, one half of a face if you turn it this way, or like sort of a Greek urn image of Janus if you turn it this way, and on and on and on and on. And I think that, right, stories give us an opportunity to encounter a character. In this case, notably a character I did not like at first, But like I end up getting to know her and feeling for her along the way, and while I connect with her, right, in a way that doesn't become magical or irrational or insignificant about, right, like, you know, sometimes you're having a bad day and you're like, oh no, this thing happened, therefore the world is against me, or something, which you know is irrational. But in a story, you get to see that irrationality and also see the logic of how something comes together and sort of experience that swirl in a way that makes it feel complete again through those metaphors or through those objects that you can hold, or at least hold in your mind. I think that's something really special about, I mean, I don't think we've noted the fact that this story is, you know,
like 6 pages?
Yeah, it's 6 pages long. And not a long 6 pages. It's incredibly dense.
Yeah.
And it does all of that in 6 pages, and like, you know, it takes me from like meeting a person, disliking a person, to liking and worrying about a person. And all of that while I also meet a dog named Mondo, who, you know, like...
It's pretty cool. It has a nice frog squeaker toy.
Yeah. And like, all these things, you know, I meet these characters. I never get the lover's name, but I start to like him and like kind of feel bad for him. You know, like, you know, and the bowl ends up holding all of that. It can't hold the keys because it's holding all that. And I think that's something that objective correlate becomes huge and wild, and it introduces me to all these possibilities, and it makes me feel bad for being a dick and hating on Andrea so early on, and like, and so on and so forth. And that's the thing stories do, man. That's incredible.
Well, it's funny that you brought up poetry, because one of the famous poetry dictums is, you know, I believe it was Dickinson was asked, what is poetry? And she says, well, if it lops your head off,
Yeah.
that's poetry.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, you can, that's a story. That's, you know, something that, like, achieves that power and meaning we're talking about here.
Yeah. I think actually, this is weird. I was reading that line today. It's blowing the top of your head off.
Okay,
right?
that's what it is, yeah.
It's funny how, like, images of what, or people describing stories and what they should do to you are often violent ones. Like, I'm thinking of like using an axe to break open like the frozen sea within you and things like that. You know.
Yeah.
But
Make you feel something.
no, I mean, I think you shouldn't feel guilty for disliking Andrea at first. I think this story is smartly taking, you know, a profession that gets a bad rap in fiction and nonfiction both, and playing with that throughout very intentionally, I think. Think about what this story would be like if Andrea were an artist.
Yeah.
It would be a much worse story.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd put a different kind of pressure on her and the things she sees. It's surprising that she's a real estate agent and, you know, looking at this bowl in such dreamy ways. But I mean, also using it to stage a home very traditionally, and doing things that are problematic throughout this story too. Like, you know, someone calls her about the bowl and asks where it's from, and she doesn't say that, you know, she got the bowl as a gift, or offer an honest answer in that exchange. You know, she is deceitful, and, I mean, in ways that are socially acceptable. I'm talking about real estate, like manipulative in the story, like all agents stage houses. You know, I mean, I think the question of like what gives an object power and meaning and a story power and meaning is tough to answer. And I mean, Adam already did it beautifully. I guess what I'd say about objects is, you know, I mean, I think I took a collections course with Andrew Monson at University of Arizona, and some of what we thought about was objects that are used as tools versus objects that are part of collections, and objects that have more of a talismanic quality, a kind of power that would be looked at but not used in a utilitarian kind of way. I think that the bowl is not a holder of keys is important in that way in the story. And And, I think in terms of meaning, I think the kind of like feeling that the bowl gives her life something, gives it beauty, gives it something that's not just practical and useful and disposable is important, that it's a treasured object and one that, is about helping her see the world and kind of stop and do things like look, feels meaningful. And in terms of stories, I think too hard to generalize, so I'll stick with this one, but I think it seems to me that like the first answer I was going to have, is a story that resists interpretation, that it's kind of constantly on its toes and, characterizing this woman in ways that are complicated, not giving us too much of her backstory, showing us these moments where she's deceitful and kind of thoughtless or hurtful. Like, isn't it strange, we haven't talked about this yet, that she's worried about keeping the bowl as a secret from her husband, but doesn't share any thoughts of guilt around the lover in the story. You can ride right past that because the story is so bowl-centric, but, coming back, you have to look at that and wonder, like, well, what's that about for her? I don't know. Or, we don't get access to the kinds of thoughts around the bowl that we might, that, she has in some ways dissociated it from the lover, that relationship left a bad taste in her mouth, but the bowl's still special. I think there's a lot of subtlety and nuance to the story, and it's constantly working to make itself more complicated and, to defy answer and expectation. And yet it's simple in its way. It's not hard to read. It's the kind of story where you ride right along with it and look at a line where she's feeling guilty about not telling him about the bowl. And if you're me, read right past it and, because of the story's order on first read, you don't know that she's had a lover at that point. So of course you go by it the first time, but I could almost go by it the second time because I get so swept up by the bowl. And I think, my, is that artful.
Well, friends, it's been fun as always. I appreciate you going bowling with me. We will see you next time. Enjoy some Ann Beattie if you have the time.
Thanks for hosting us, Ann.
Thanks, man.